here's the first question for our panelists that has to do with the vision for AI in medicine. So what is your vision of the role of intelligence systems in the effort to improve human health? What are the key challenges and areas of opportunity for improving human health and the healthcare system using AI? And how do you anticipate that AI systems will interact with physicians and patients in 20 years from now? And how will they change the way in which patients and clinicians interact among themselves?
Well, hi, everyone. Before I launch into my clever conversation, I too wanted to say thanks, particularly to Alan and Rich. I'm not sure, but I think I may be the only student from that first class in 87, 88 that went through. Anyway, that's when I went through the program. It was certainly an experiment at that time. But I greatly enjoyed it, and it's taken me a long way in these past 30 years. So, going to the questions. We only have a couple of minutes each, and we could probably spend half an hour each on some of these questions. But I'll tell you a few things that I see. First, roles for intelligent systems. I see two big areas. One is actually a term that I think a lot of people are using these days, AI augmentation. And I think that particularly for clinicians, this is probably the area that you'll see the most of in coming years. For those of us in healthcare, we keep hearing about the knowledge explosion, exponential increase, and really, it's not, when you're practicing medicine these days, it's not a question of how much you know. It's a question of how good you are at finding the answers. And so I see us using, in various domains of medicine, using AI in the context of augmentation, of being a sort of really smart sidekick that can help you get the answers you need. And Jerry Osheroff is the guy that coined the CDS5 rights, but it's really getting the right information to the right person in the right format through the right channel at the right point in workflow, and that's going to be very important. The other, of course, and really the area that we hear the most of, I think, sometimes is just knowledge discovery. All of the advanced analytics, predictive analytics, all the ways that machine learning and AI are really advancing our ability to look at large data sets. Challenges. You heard, I was really enjoying Martha's conversation with us because she started to get into it. I think our challenges are not so much on the technical side as on the socio-technical side. And I put one up here, graceful degradation. That's a term that we often use around the fall-off in performance that's acceptable. And for some of the younger folks here, some of the students here perhaps, I'd say to you that one area of research, one that's really, really important, is the ability to be able to say, wait, I'm in over my head. How do you get a system that is smart enough to know when its advice or the output is no longer reliable? And that's going to be really important, especially as we get more and more into AI applications in healthcare for consumers who really, they're not going to know when to stop listening to the system. The other one is trust. And Martha mentioned, the fake news problems. Well, when it comes to healthcare, there's just so much out there. You're just bombarded with articles and applications telling you what to do, and increasingly, it's going to be our challenge in research to try to figure out how we can create systems and how we can create policies and social mechanisms that allow us to say this is something that you can trust. And then finally, opportunities. When they asked me this, again, you could spend a long time talking about opportunities, but a couple of areas that I thought of. One is much more direct, really autonomous or unsupervised interaction between devices and people. That can come in the form of advice. It may be that in the future, your Blue Cross Blue Shield plan may want to shift some costs, and maybe they're going to have you talking to a robot before you actually talk to a live person. Not necessarily attractive, but that's something that's going to happen. And really, I think it turns to us to put together the types of applications that will support that. Another one that is already coming to fruition is in the area of smart devices, really direct patient interaction. There's a woman who lectures right now on the hacking her artificial pancreas. Basically, the drug companies and the device companies, for liability reasons, are reluctant to do something like field a device that will make life and death decisions around things like your blood sugar. The technology is actually there right now, but it's not being fielded. And this woman who lectures on this all the time is a young woman that developed diabetes when she was in her teens and was scared to death of dying in the middle of the night from hypoglycemia. So she was a developer and wrote her artificial pancreas. And there's a lot like that happening out there, and there are so many potential applications for AI in the device realm. And then finally, going beyond analytics, right now we hear a lot about AI and things like predictive analytics. I think the next frontier there is not using AI to discover information or to discourage knowledge in data sets. It's to actually discover knowledge and then decide what to do with it, what additional research to do. It's the frontier of essentially self-guided knowledge discovery that doesn't depend on someone looking at the results and then saying, these are interesting, these aren't.
Well, I'm going to put on my biased lens of language technology and say my vision of AI is really involving computer understanding. And I think we're really far from that, and as Wired said, it's kind of the next frontier that we just haven't gotten to yet. And this is a video that you could watch on your own if you're interested, and it's a electronic health record that's just listening in on what's going in the patient visit, and then it's pulling information from their own hospital, from different hospitals, from their genetic testing, family history, and showing it to them when the time is right, so it's bringing that right information at the right time. And when I was a new graduate student working in natural language processing, one of my older professors said, it's a dead end. That I just hate that. I hate that area. The only way it'll ever be useful is if it can listen to me in my conversations with my patient, and that's never going to happen. And I think, it seems feasible. I don't know. Anyone who has Alexa thinks it's still a long ways off, but I think that's the direction we have to go.
So I wanted to just mention briefly that personal health behavior is really a major impact on health and health care cost, as we all know. This is a graphic that just shows that, and I don't know if the percentages are exactly right, but a large percentage of health care is due to behavior. Things that people can control, like diet and exercise, and it leads to a lot of cost, a lot of medical cost, and morbidity and mortality as well. So what I wanted to just envision is an AI personal health assistant. This is a system that really learns about and is concerned about an individual's health, and is really the only reason for existing is to help that person optimize their health. So here we have that it could remind you about a health-related task. It could inform you about pertinent and up-to-date health knowledge from the literature, and sort of filter that for you based on what it knows about you. Encourage and support healthy behaviors. So using information about human psychology and about you personally, being able to make recommendations that optimize your chances of actually doing different kinds of exercise or following different kinds of diets, very tailored to you and very knowledgeable about current state-of-the-art ways to help people optimize their behavior. It could watch and warn about dangers that you might be experiencing in the environment that you're in, monitor your health and detect signs of ill health and impending ill health, so be a very sensitive kind of monitor of what's going on with you, maybe in terms of your coughing, your temperature, your heart rate, many other possible indicators of your health. Automatically contact appropriate healthcare services in an emergency and know which service to contact and what to say to get them there as quickly as possible. Could help you make decisions about seeking health care. Sometimes one of the most difficult things is to figure out when and where to seek health. What kind of practitioner might be the right practitioner for your problem, and trying to help you kind of triage where to go and to seek health immediately. And then inform clinicians about your history and condition if you allow the system to do that. So if the system's monitoring your health and helping you do that, and it's very smart about being able to monitor you and your environment, it could potentially provide a lot of information to the healthcare system about what's been going on with you to help with your diagnosis and treatment. And then it finally assists you in your recovery if you do have a health problem in many different ways. So that's my one view of what I envision as a potential health aid in the future, maybe the next 10 to 20 years.
So echoing Barry's AI augmentation, but making it maybe a little more concrete. For example, my vision is that, for example, an intelligent system will recommend what is the highest value intervention, or the 3 or the 5 highest value interventions at a 15-minute visit. Under our current payment system, doctors are under tremendous time pressure to get patients through the clinic, and the 15-minute visit we're all too familiar with, and neither the doctors nor the patients like it, but it's the real world. So, there's cancer screening guidelines, cholesterol screening guidelines. Patient might have a history of asthma. So at your annual visit with your doctor, what 3 things are most going to impact your health and prolong your life? It's a very decision theoretic thing, so you can tell I trained under somebody who trained under Greg. The question asked for about challenges, and so the new challenges are the same as the old challenges. So the new challenges meet the old challenges. Barry already talked about the knowledge cliff or performance cliff. A lot of times we learn models, but we don't update them with new data. So there's an article in Science about big data hubris, about Google flu trends. And what really caused Google flu trends to go haywire is reality changed out from under their model, and they didn't update their model with the data. A lot of talk about integrating AI into the clinician workflow and the patient's life flow, if you will. This is where a lot of AI goes haywire and ultimately fails, and we heard a lot of examples of that. And with all the hoopla and hype and interest and progress in deep learning, it's still a black box. And explanation, I did my master's in explanation, so obviously I'm going to echo that theme, but explanation is still an issue, and this relates to Barry's issue of trust. And then what does it look like in 20 years? I'd like to see patient adherence is better because we're recommending interventions that they're more likely to do. So we need to do colon cancer screening, but there are patients who would rather die than have a colonoscopy. Well, okay, but they might do fecal immunochemistry testing, which although it's not as great a test, at least some screening is probably better than no screening. So by taking patient preferences into account, and I have a faculty working for me who has a mathematical background but also works in the area of decision theory, had an NCI grant to build a multi-attribute utility model and all the mathematics of combining the attributes into an ultimate score. But the goal was to get Hispanic men to do more colon cancer screening, and he had a collaborator in El Paso, so it was very innovative and interesting project.
Thank you. That was quite interesting. We're moving to our second question, which has to do with what did we learn historically? What were the important breakthroughs in medical AI that promise major advances for the future of healthcare? And what were the dead ends that failed to deliver, and how these successes and failures can help us move forward in a better way?
All right. Well, kicking this one off. You know, 30 years ago, I was a grad student and also a fellow in the informatics program here. And I got the bright idea on my 10 megabyte hard drive IBM AT of trying to do something to do a back propagation network that looked at regulating blood sugars. And that was my master's thesis. Rich there somehow or other approved it, although it was a little outlandish at the time. But you know, in its infancy, the whole area of machine learning and neural networks in particular, that there was a sort of blossoming of that in the late 80s, and there were smart folks here, aside from the folks in the ISP program, folks like Jeff Hinton and Jay McClellan at CMU, and it was heady stuff. It went away. It literally went away for quite a few years through the 90s, and of course, everyone knows, you know, I printed out this paper, for those of you who can't see it, Navigating the Hype of Healthcare Artificial Intelligence Companies. Last week, I was in Las Vegas at the Health Information Management Systems Society show, and there were 50,000 people there, and there were about 3,000 companies, and at least 10% of them were trying to say, we are an artificial intelligence company, and we're doing something really smart with machine learning or neural network. It was like on every banner. So I think that's an area that had its initial blossoming, but then has really come back big, and it's really important today, and we're making tremendous slides there. Flip side, disappointments, or I don't want to make this too big a point, but you know, we had a first round of diagnostic decision support expert systems. And Bruce Buchanan's not here, but he was certainly a pioneer with some of that, things like eMice and Ted Shortlift at Stanford, Randy Miller here at Pittsburgh with QMR, and before that Internist One, the X-Plane at Mass General. All of them were expert systems that allowed you to say, my patient has a cough and a fever and is productive of sputum, and of course it would come back like an oracle and tell you what the top 5 most likely diagnoses were. I think we found that that's not a viable approach, and it's one that if there's a failure, it's realizing that expert systems and in general AI is better in an advisory role than in a primary independent role, at least in medicine. So I put that down as my disappointment. And the other is the need to handcraft knowledge for systems like that. And finally, what did we learn? Well, it's a sort of trite answer, but it's really true that in all fairness to Brian and the challenge of autonomous cars, medical reasoning's really tough, and I think even harder than getting your car to drive around by itself.
I would diagnose most failures of medical informatics solutions as the people. And Reed Gardner's he was the chair previously at Utah, and he came to give a talk to us a couple of weeks ago, and he put this quote up, which was his most often quoted comment about clinical informatics success is 80% sociology and 20% technology. And I think that's true today. It's how the human interacts with these devices.
Okay, thanks, Constantine. So I think I just wanted to talk about a modeling trend in computer-aided medical diagnostic systems that happened over the last 50 or 60 years. I think that and this is obviously a generalization, but I think there's something to it. It was largely data-centric in terms of simple Bayes models, for example, and those were explored. And then in the 1970s and 80s, it was more knowledge-centric with things like rule-based systems as diagnostic systems, and that was explored. And then in the 1990s until now, really, I would say, in my view, it's been more data-centric with Bayesian networks and methods for learning Bayesian networks from data, which has been very useful. And then more recently, deep learning models, which have been having a lot of successes, including some interesting work that's just recently been published in using those for diagnostic models that had some good performance. So in terms of what's coming up in the next decade and onward, I think that there's going to likely be a combination of data and knowledge. It's not real surprising, but I think they're both going to be sort of balanced. And medical textbooks, systems being able to read the medical literature in a very deep sort of way and model what's in the literature, and then combine that with data so that the starting point for these systems is some basic deep knowledge about medicine, but they can tailor that based on what's being learned from a huge amount of data about real patients. So that's what I wanted to mention. And I just one other point, I'm sorry, is to say that this is related closely to a effort that's been going on for the last 5 or so years called Learning Health Systems. Chuck Friedman and many others have been leading in this effort. But the idea there is really that we have clinical practice at the top. That generates data. From that data, we learn knowledge. And that knowledge then can influence practice. And in some ways, this is kind of obvious, but what Learning Health Systems is trying to do is to automate this and make this a much tighter loop than it is right now. Right now, practice may take 17 years before the data needs to knowledge changes practice. And you'd like to have a much tighter loop where you get feedback on what's working and what's not working. You develop knowledge from that, which gets actually validated in some rigorous way within the system across the country or world, and then that influences practice much tighter, much shorter period than 17 years. So those are my comments.
Okay, so diagnostic decision support systems were a seminal breakthrough in the sense that they were an existence proof that you could build AI that achieves human level performance. And so, and I think it's probably the first case of that being shown in healthcare. And I don't know, it was probably shown in other fields, but in healthcare, it's very complex, medical reasoning is different in many ways and it's complex. So they were a breakthrough in that sense. However, they were also a dead end. I have a slide I show my students in the Foundations of Biomedical Informatics course called the ash heap of the history of biomedical informatics, and I Google imaged an ash heap and I put D-explain, QMR, with all due respect to the QMR and D-explain and Iliad folks. But they had almost no impact on patient care. Doctors don't use them to make better diagnoses. And what the literature on diagnostic error has since shown is that doctors are overconfident in their wrong diagnoses. So this was not something, despite the fact that Jack Myers, who was the chairman of the Department of Medicine, led the project, as a whole, as a community, physicians are not worried about how good their diagnoses are. They think their diagnoses are just fine, thank you very much. And I don't need any help with my diagnosis. So they didn't use them. And there's a lot of workflow issues. There was no integration with the EHR, which I'm going to talk about with my next bullet point. You know, if you make the doctor go out of the EHR to do something else, they're not going to do it. Again, it's a 15-minute issue. They count clicks. If it takes 5 clicks to write a prescription, and then you upgrade the EHR, and now it takes 6 clicks to write a prescription, you're done. The chair of medicine's going to call the CIO, the CEO, and it's going to be bad. So you have to integrate into the workflow. You have to integrate into the EHR, which is why Watson is on life support. So it's not a dead end. It could end up as a dead end for the same reason that the diagnostic decision support systems ended up as a dead end. What's the incentive for expert level cancer therapy recommendations and diagnosis from a computer in our current payment model? So there's a high profile failure of Watson already in healthcare with MD Anderson. First of all, they came in with a product that was hardly trained for cancer. They trained it for 6 or 7 leukemias and then lung cancer. You're still missing, you know, the 3 of the big 4: breast cancer, breast, lung. Well, they did lung, breast, prostate, colon. Thank you. And MD Anderson spent $60 million on a project that was budgeted for 2, and Watson didn't help the treatment of patients. There's a clinic in Jupiter, Florida, where a nurse has to enter the patient information into Watson and get the oracle back, and then the doctor looks at it and says, yeah, that's what I was going to do anyway. So again, the new challenges meet the old challenges. So the key lesson learned there is context is key. These, you know, obviously, you know, per Martha's brilliant keynote speech, you know, our AI technologies exist in a social, cultural, economic, policy milieu. And if you don't take that into account, your AI technologies can perform at human levels, but have no impact for the greater good, for social justice, for healthcare, for whatever.
Thank you. So our third question is about current and future successes. So our panelists, while we're preparing this session, were challenged to think about 1 to 3 AI-enabled advances in health science and healthcare that have proven major value. Because after all, we have to show value in order to get adoption. And also to predict a similar number of forthcoming AI-enabled advances in health science and healthcare. And also, part of the technical context here is how big data science and precision medicine relate to AI for improving health. In the interest of time, I would like you to stick to a 2.5 minute time limit so that we leave enough time for our audience at the end. Thank you.
Well, so I'm actually going to skip this one. So how's that for
This is amazing.
we're not going to get through it.
Okay. So I'm not going to answer all of those questions, but I would say clinical decision support has been successful where where everything's right, where it's integrated into the EHR, and you know there's a lot of things that make it work or not work. But I think that they've shown to be successful. But there's been a real challenge over the last 10 years or so as everyone switched from their homegrown electronic health records to vendor systems like Cerner and Epic, and it kind of made clinical informaticists say, who are we and what are we here for? And so I think that now there's a resurgence where we've developed standards that allow us to create applications that we can integrate into the EHR, but they're not housed on the EHR, so you can do fancy computations on them. You can do nice visual analytics and things that you can't do within Epic, for example, but it looks like it's within Epic. It's just happening, you know, somewhere else. And so I think that's, over the next 10 years, is going to really transform our ability to be successful in this space. And of course, we can't just design a bunch of apps and put them together and then recreate the experience. I think we also have to be thinking about how do we reimagining how we interact and what the EHR is for on top of what we're given with the vendor system.
So this is basically having to do with precision medicine, but I think that one vision I have is that we're going to be able to develop, with the help of AI, a detailed, comprehensive, personalized, causal, and anatomical model of each person. And we all are different, obviously, causally. There are differences that we have in terms of our some of our molecular physiology, and obviously in terms of some of our anatomy. And some of those differences are significant when you talk about treatment and which medications to use and so forth, and what are the interactions among medications. So I think we're going to get towards, and this will take a long time to get there, you know, to an ultimate degree, but I think we're going to be moving along this path where we really can do individual reasoning. And this can enable this will be constructed from extensive knowledge that we already have about human structure and function, but also the massive amounts of data that we're going to be able to get on each individual. And one of the projects right now, some of you may have heard of it, All of Us, which is gathering data on 1 million people in the United States. It's a very active project. It's both omics data and clinical data, and actually Sham Vesweswaran, who's one of the co-PIs of that project in this area that's gathering data on 150,000 patients, is back here. He was a student in the ISP and is now a faculty. But this is a website if you're interested in being involved in that, being one of the 1 million people. And that kind of data is going to drive the ability to build these kinds of models. And then I think it'll be used to precisely optimize the healthcare for each of us if the system has such a model. And then advanced knowledge of human structure, function, and disease. This is sort of related back to the learning health system. And then another one I'll go through rather quickly because of Constantine's warning, using a little bit of Barry's time. So this is another vision that I have about, that I wanted to put forward about an approach to clinical decision support tools that are based on machine learning of the electronic medical record systems. And here we have applications that include intelligent EMR systems that display the right data at the right time. And again, the idea is that you'd want to have the EMR really focus the clinician on the data that is going to be the most useful, still providing the ability to get at all the data. This is a project, again, Sham is PI of a project called the Learning Electronic Medical Record System that is doing just this in a beginning phase of this research. Another is to show typical clinical orders in a given patient care context. So what do people usually give in terms of orders for a patient like this patient? Just as a reminder to the clinician about what is the typical care for this kind of patient so that they can use that as maybe a reminder if they wish to have it. And then selectively alerting, so you've already presented the right data at the right time for the right context. You've shown perhaps then typical kinds of care that are given for this patient to provide some ideas if the clinician wants them. At this point, if the clinician makes a choice for care of a patient that's very unusual based on a probabilistic model that you've built over thousands or hundreds of thousands of patients, if that's really an unusual care action, then you'd like to be able to alert on it and say, maybe not, this is not wrong, but this is very unusual to give this medication to this kind of patient at this time. And this is work that Milos Hasrecht, who's here, is the PI of looking at this kind of work. Yes, those are my comments. Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, so in the interest of time, I'll skip my first top-level bullet. With respect to the second bullet, where the healthcare system does emphasize value over volume, which isn't often enough, there's a lot of interesting work going on in predictive analytics. So like sepsis. Hospitals do get penalized when patients get septic and have bed sepsis outcomes, so they're incentivized to work on it. So there's a lot of research going on. I'm part of an R01 project led by a critical care physician to develop predictive analytics around surgery, acute kidney injury, and sepsis. So if you can intervene early, or if you know the patient's going to get septic before there's any signs of it, outward signs of it that a clinician would recognize, you can prevent it or intervene early and have better outcomes. With respect to the third bullet, there's a real opportunity. Once the health insurance plans pay for sequencing, then we'll start doing a lot of it and doing it routinely. It's just going to be way too much information for the doctors to manage. I mean, they're already overwhelmed, but this is just really going to be crushing. And so AI technologies that are able to survey the genome are regularly updated with new knowledge from the research literature. And hey, this patient's at risk for X, Y, and Z, and you ought to do A, B, and C about it today. As one maybe perhaps somewhat more concrete example of that, even just from pharmacogenomics, we know that a drug's mechanism of action works on one protein, or like an enzyme or a channel in the cellular membrane or some transporter. But they also interact with a lot of other proteins besides that one. So there's lots of so-called targets that drugs have. And we don't know a lot about the off-target effects of all drugs, but as we learn more about those, I can envision AI that takes a systems biology approach to analyze all the effects of all the targets of all the patient's drugs and predicts adverse effects, drug-drug interactions, unique to that patient because their genome may make them more or less susceptible to various on and off-target effects of drugs.
So our fourth and final question has to do with safety and risks, and it really emphasizes this notion of responsibility and protection of patients and not creating disturbances in the system that are just unmanageable. So the question is, do we have enhanced safeguard methodologies? Do we need such in order to de-risk health applications of intelligence systems? And specifically, what kinds of safeguards need to be in place for AI-enabled clinical decision-making that's of a high risk, and in parallel of high-risk AI-enabled healthcare operations decision-making, because these are two parallel universes that interact, but at the same time, they're not exactly the same type of decision-making.
All right, I'm taking back my 2 minutes here. Despite, Bill, you're calling it the ash heap of history, I'm not sure if I should be personally. I started a company that commercialized QMR from here at the University of Pittsburgh in the early 90s. And yes, I'm not a billionaire, so clearly it didn't go as well as it might have, but we did okay. There was some interest. But one of the things was that studies have shown that a typically trained internist in diagnostic decision support making is about 65% of the time on average on the first shot. So before they've gotten to collect more information. And some of the early studies with these diagnostic decision support systems showed that they had a higher rate of accuracy. Clearly, that wasn't good enough. In medicine, we have a real risk bias, and it's a little analogous. When Brian was talking earlier today, and he was talking about autonomous cars, it's not okay if the car performs as well as human, right? It's got to perform way better. Because if it performed as well as a human, clearly it would be getting in accidents a lot. And I think when it comes to AI and healthcare, you have to recognize that risk bias, and you have to recognize it's just a fact, and we're going to have to deal with it, and there will be a need to deal with it. So for those of you that are just coming up the ranks and doing research in this area, I guess I would ask you to consider that when you're developing a system, you need to be thinking about things like, how can I rationalize or explain why it works the way it does, especially in systems that have so-called hidden units or opaque sections to their reasoning. The other thing is does it need to be retested if you've trained it on data? If it's a supervised learning system, what sort of built-in capacity do you have to periodically retrain it, excuse me, because medical data changes and things change over time, and the best treatment today isn't the best treatment tomorrow. And lastly, what I wanted to say is that the future is here when it comes to this aspect, because perhaps in cars we're not really carefully certifying and regulating them at this time, and I think that's great. That's not the case in healthcare, and I put a little reference there. When it comes to clinical decision support software and medical devices that provide decision support, the FDA just issued a preliminary rule. So they will, as of this coming year, when you market an artificial intelligence application that provides medical advice, whether it's through a device like an insulin pump, or whether it's even in some cases devices that are aimed at consumers, for instance, for detecting heart arrhythmias if you're wearing it on your Apple Watch. It'll have to go through a certification process, and that's important, I think, to consider as you develop these applications, because there's going to be a much higher bar to entry. And the last thing I wanted to mention, which is related, but it's not quite the same, is the whole idea of trust with AI applications, particularly where you have consumers using things directly, and particularly in the case of healthcare, which is a very sensitive topic. It's going to be very important to be able to build in this concept of trust, so that the person who is using it knows where it's coming from, how the advice was constructed, really the fact that they can trust whatever advice is being dispensed. And that's going to become more and more important, especially, Martha, you were talking about fake news. It's getting harder and harder to know what is, in fact, good advice. And that sort of social environment that we're in is going to have its impact on healthcare.
So this is building on what we've already talked about. I think there's two ends of the spectrum. One end is, I don't trust this, it's a black box, I don't need your advice, I know exactly what to do. And the other end is, this is what the computer told me to do, so I'm going to do it even though it doesn't make sense. And there are examples of that. The Digital Doctor. Has anyone read The Digital Doctor? It describes this case study where somebody, they gave a teenage boy 17 times the medication, and he didn't die, luckily, but it was just failure after failure, and reliance on not only the EHR that gave the advice, but that generated the prescription, but also that the process had been accurate, that the humans had checked it, and it must be right even though it doesn't make sense. And so that trust.
Okay, I'm just going to look up here. So here's one. This is the wild and crazy part of the panel, but I'm serious about what I'm about to say. An approach to AI safety is fairly general, but includes health safety, healthcare. So the general notion that I want to put forth is to emulate one of the most successful safety systems in human history. And the components of that system consist of a constitution that outlines the principles of a given AI system's behavior. And I know we have Asimov's 3 laws. That's too small a constitution. You need to put a lot more work in Philadelphia into the Constitution than are in Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. So it's not a trivial thing, but I think it's something that can be done. And then a separation of powers among 3 independently constructed and operated AI systems. The first system is an executive AI system that continuously proposes actions to take, such as which medication to give a particular patient. There is a judicial AI system that monitors the proposed actions of the executive AI and can block any individual action that it rules to be inconsistent with the Constitution or with the laws generated by the legislative AI system. And then we have a legislative AI system that generates constraints or laws that are consistent with the Constitution regarding what the executive AI can do and can shut it down for sufficient cause as specified in the Constitution. So the main idea here, and I realize, and I do think that this is something to think about, these are separate systems. These are systems that are built independently, and they operate independently. Even if it doesn't end up being broken down exactly this way, I think we need to have independent AI systems that are monitoring other AI systems and have an ability to complain about them or to shut them down. And that those systems have different goals and are built with different purposes, one being to maintain the safety, of the patient. And I've talked about these as systems, but each of these components, legislative, judicial, and executive, could actually be composed of independently constructed AI systems themselves that have to vote on their decisions. One issue that's not up here that we might think about is who are the voters, okay, that vote in the legislature, that vote in the executive. And I think that needs to be us, and how we have an input into these systems is an unsolved problem, but I think it's an important problem to work on. So
before I give this to Bill, I want to say that there's going to be a special impeachment module in this, so whomever wants to work on that.
That's hard to follow. Yeah. So I'll just make one quick point, which is the time a clinician spends interacting with our AI is almost always time taken away from doing other things, including perhaps talking to you, the patient, and noticing how you're breathing and noticing your skin color and all the other subtle clues a clinician gains about your overall state of health. So we have to be careful and make sure that that time spent interacting with AI is an improvement over what they were spending their time doing previously. It's not done nearly often enough.
Okay, so first let me thank our panelists for their wonderful contributions to this discussion. And now Harry is going to field questions from the audience, so please.
So I have a question. When you talked about the failures of AI in medical systems, isn't it because we went too far too quickly? Like, you can imagine that if I go to a doctor, I'm frustrated because I have to drive to his office, I have to wait there, then the doctor examines me, I get a huge bill at the end. And with a cell phone, if I have a rash, maybe I can just show the doctor the rash through the cell phone, he can diagnose me, it's gonna be quick, it's gonna be cheap. And I think that would, like, simple things like this, like new technology, like cell phones, completely change the medicine. And it doesn't have to have any AI component.
I don't think it was we went too far too quick so much as maybe a little bit of hype I think that the lesson was, and Randy Miller wrote a great article in the mid-90s, the end of the Oracle model. I think it's that you have to remember that no matter how smart the AI is, it still needs to be interpreted by someone. So I think it was more just recognition that we're never going to replace, at least in healthcare professionals, theoretically in consumers, it would be a direct interaction. But in the case of mediating it via clinicians, I think you'll have to always interpret it through the lens of that clinician.
A quick story. I have a colleague who's a family doctor here in Pittsburgh, involved in informatics, CMIO type, now in private sector. But he's driving with his son. He gets a call from a patient. He spends 20 to 30 minutes on the phone with the patient, calls in a prescription, even I think was able to check the EHR from his phone with allergies and all that. And his son at the end of that goes, "Dad, how much did you make for all that?" And he goes, "0." And he goes, "Dad, you're an idiot." The incentives are all wrong.
I guess I want to challenge this assumption that A, the healthcare systems are going to have to be way better than doctors at diagnoses before we accept them, and that B, the doctors are never going to, well, the doctors, I'm not arguing that they'll never be replaced, but that these systems couldn't, again, put a lot of doctors out of business. I mean, driving cars aren't going to have to be way better. They're just going to have to be a little bit better and a lot cheaper than the Uber drivers before I think we start to see Uber drivers replaced by automated cars. Now, doctors have a lot more power, but you're also a lot more expensive. And while I do think that ultimately a lot of patients are going to want that human touch, a lot of patients can't afford healthcare access right now, and I'm not entirely convinced that if the diagnostic systems aren't as good as you guys, that there aren't going to be a class of people for whom that'll be a really good solution as soon as they're just a little bit better. So why do you think otherwise?
Yeah, this one works. So first, there's some actual technical challenges that we really didn't go into in this conversation. But for instance, most of these diagnostic decision support systems, in any given set of symptoms, so the patient says, "Hey, I've got a cough, and I've got a fever, and I've got a headache." All right, comes back and says, "Oh, I think you have," what do you think it says? You don't have to be a doctor to answer this one. All right, the flu. Well, a lot of those diagnostic decision support systems might come back and say, yeah, you have the flu, but they might also say, oh, maybe you've got dengue fever too. The reason being that for lack of a better word, there's this element of common sense. There's this saying in healthcare, when you hear hoofbeats, don't think of zebras. And there's a similar sort of thing around expert systems. So there are still real technical challenges, and I don't want to completely put those aside. But let's just say that that the system becomes so good that it deals with those sorts of issues. Then no, I think it's going to happen. I put it on my slide. Completely autonomous, robotic interactions, and health systems will be doing that for, if nothing else, cost reasons, because the time is so expensive. But I also believe that there is still something, there's still some lens there where when it gets really complicated, really multifactorial situations where you should be glad if it's escalated to the human being.
I want to just respond to what you said, Barry, and challenge kind of that paternal view that we need to protect patients from seeing all the other things they might have. I mean, they already can see that.
Just saying it shouldn't,
it complicates it. Yeah, and I think you're talking about different audiences. If the consumer of the technology is the physician, they're going to have a different bar than if the consumer is a patient. And so making these devices that are for patients, it opens up a whole new world.
I would just say one more thing. Physicians are expensive, but they're only 8 to 20% of healthcare costs. The real driver of healthcare costs is the doctor's metaphorical pen. The metaphorical pen, the doctor's pen, is the driver of healthcare costs. What they order and do that costs more than how much they make. So it's their decision making, and it's really influencing doctors' decision making is where you bend the cost curve, not so much. Although salary, they're expensive. Expensive FTEs.
Yeah, and to take that one step further, again, to your point, Wendy, in terms of using AI, I think anyone who goes to a doctor these days should, run their symptoms or run their situation past an AI before they go to the doctor, so that when they get there, they've got their list and they've got the information that they need. Just anecdotally, how many of you have done 23andMe? Just out of curiosity. 23andMe. So 23andMe is a service. You basically spit in a test tube and send it to them, and they analyze your DNA, and they'll do a pretty complete genomic profile on you. It was actually started by the wife of one of the founders of Google, actually started the company. In any event, to your point, Konstantin, I did 23andMe, and I learned all sorts of really cool things. And further, I had to go to my doctor, my primary care doctor, and bring my report with him and say, oh, by the way, should we check, we should check me for macular degeneration because I have a genetic disposition to it, or do you know that I'm Leiden factor 5 positive? So there's a lot of stuff out there, and I think AI, just to get back to our topic, AI has a role in helping patients sift through that mountain of information that's overwhelming the physicians at this point. And if there's any good application, it's to help people decide what to do with the assistance of their clinicians, because the clinicians can't do it themselves.
Just a quick query for Greg, actually. Your sort of constitutional metaphor may have been a little bit of a stretch too far, but it does raise an interesting possibility, given all the earlier discussion of transparency of AI reasoning in medicine. Would it make more sense, rather than trying to F the ineffable by explaining, deep learning results, to essentially have separate systems that take a look at the outcome of systems that can't explain themselves, and try to come up with the best account of how that kind of an outcome could have been generated? That is, I guess what I'm suggesting is, even if it doesn't make sense to think in terms of the U.S. constitutional categories, does it make sense to think about having independent actors in the AI scene?
Yes, I agree. I think that this was just one model, and it's a good starting point, but I think that the general point is that, and I think this is what you're making, is that we need to have independent systems that are questioning each other and telling us about it if they need to. But there needs to be a dynamic. Those need to be independently developed for independent purposes. And I really, honestly, I can't, it's hard for me to imagine how we're going to get all this to work without something like that when I think more and more about it. But exactly how you do it, I don't know, but I know they need to be independent. They don't need to be built by the same group under the same assumptions.
And Alan, again, that's legislated at this point. The FDA preliminary rule includes language to the effect of any system offering advice, any clinical decision support system has to have the capability of explaining the reasons for its advice. Well, think about that, because that's...
I don't think the explanation necessarily comes from the system that generates the
It may not, but it'll have to have that capability added to it in order for it to be certified.
Explaining a deep multi-layered system isn't going to generate an explanation anyone's going to be interested in hearing.
was thinking there's a lot to take in for me. I'm actually in the School of Pharmacy, and I'm a new professor in the Department of Pharmaceutical Sciences. Worked in industry for a long period of time, and I'm coming here, and it's interesting to hear the viewpoint on AI, something that I haven't paid as much attention to directly, but I think in some ways have. And I want to just maybe throw out a couple of comments for you to respond to. One is I do think that maybe this is a bias, but I'm not sure that AI is going to save the cost of U.S. healthcare. I could be wrong, but I'm not sure it's going to. But what I do think it's going to do, and the reason I say, I mean, obviously there are other countries that are doing things okay without, you know, an extensive amount of AI. It might, but I think where it does really come in is, and you mentioned it before, the systems biology portion, the trying to deal with the mounds of data that we have now with pharmacogenomics, with really trying to do a lot more to be able to diagnose the patient. And I know in our group, for example, we're doing a lot of things with UPMC in pharmacogenomics and really trying to look at that helping diagnosis. I think that that AI in combination with a lot of the other maybe more sophisticated analysis platforms and stuff, I think has a tremendous tremendous chance to make a difference. But some of the other stuff I'm not sure about, and maybe you can comment further or.
So thank you. I would like to ask the panelists for a very quick response because we saw the yellow sign of doom. So please be brief.
I think we're going to find out. I mean, these are all complicated issues, and there's a lot of uncertainty around exactly how this is all going to play out. I think we're making our best guesses about what the future looks like, but we all know that it's likely to turn out different than that. We hope that some of these things will be accurate, but almost certainly not all of them. So I think we all sort of gave our visions with implicit confidence intervals that are fairly wide, but just giving you our best projection of what we think the expectation is going to look like. So,
And
yeah.
that's why this is on video. So that the next anniversary, we
Is
can
this
look
on
back
video?
at this.
You're
Yeah.
kidding. Oh my goodness.
So thank you.